I would now like to invite our second speaker, Dr. James Russell, for his presentation.
Kia ora tātou from Aotearoa in New Zealand. What I'm going to talk about today over the next 10 minutes is just demonstrating how the mechanism that drove COVID-19 spreading around the world as a function of globalization is really just a special case of what we already see with invasive species that have spread to many of our island nations. And so our response to COVID in New Zealand and elsewhere is very similar to our response to invasive species. And because of that, there's a lot we can already learn to protect our biodiversity, but also see how protecting our biodiversity through managing invasive species and microorganisms and diseases arriving also benefits our communities and our livelihoods. Next slide. So it was great that Kosi already mentioned that there's many types of biodiversity on islands. There's genetic diversity, there's species diversity, there's also functional diversity, the way species interact with one another, as well as the different habitat diversities we see across the Pacific Ocean. So those are really all important to consider when we're talking about protecting biodiversity as well as protecting humans from the threats of invasive species and disease. Next slide. So some of my colleagues have recently published some work looking at this interface between understanding ecological processes and COVID-19. And here we can see a number of other health outbreaks that have occurred across the history of time and how many deaths they've resulted in. And what's really jumps out here is that most of those species that have driven these outbreaks have been introduced species, particularly invasive ones. We see things such as rats, mosquitoes, pigs and camels are invasive in Australia. So the way these diseases, these zoonotic diseases spread around the world is through these globalization processes that spread introduced species and disease. So as Stacey alluded to earlier, these weedy species that benefit, and we do have opportunities to eradicate some of these as we have been doing with rats across the Pacific Ocean. Next slide. So some other colleagues also recently pointed out that it is very similar, although COVID-19, you might not classify it as an invasive species per se, the way it spread around the world and infected people is very similar to the way invasive species spread around the world and infect islands. Both invasive species and COVID grow in nature, they spread to new locations, they explode across the population and create impacts where we then have to respond to them through things such as vaccinations or eradication programs. Next slide. And that's really important because we did a review recently of threats to IUCN Red listed species. And so islands make up only 5% of the world's land area, but 50% of the threatened species on the IUCN Red list occur on islands. So already a species that's threatened is much more likely to be on an island. There's something about islands that makes species more likely to be threatened. And further that still, when we look at the different threats to these species, we can see things such as overexploitation and agricultural activity and urban development are prevalent, but the only threat on the IUCN Red list that's more likely to be a problem on islands is invasion and disease. So if you're a species on an island or living in an island nation, the disproportionate threat to your biodiversity and also humans and your livelihoods is invasive species and disease. Next slide. And that's problematic because although we all have different invasive species we're dealing with on our different island nations, if we look down at the Pacific, at the bottom of the slide in particular, only a quarter of the invasive species in the Pacific Islands, only a quarter of the islands in the Pacific have most of those species. So we've actually still got a lot more species of invasive species that are prone to being spread. There's only a small number of invasive species that have actually spread to all islands. So although wasps might be a problem on one island, a plant might be a problem on another, an ant on another, they haven't arrived at all islands. So there's still a lot more spread that could happen. Next slide. And so that's why biosecurity is so important. We already know this for managing larger invasive species. We know we have to do things pre-border and post-border. We have to prepare before things depart from their origin. We have to manage a quarantine process manage the invasive species on vessels. Even when things arrive at our border, we have to be prepared for these invasive species and diseases as they arrive after our border. So there's these biosecurity processes both in transit and then in surveillance afterwards. And it's important to bear in mind that the probability of preventing the disease or the species establishing decreases the further along the pathway you are. And as you've probably all been reading in Aotearoa, New Zealand at the moment, we successfully eradicated COVID from New Zealand using the very similar approaches we use for managing invasive species on islands when we eradicate those. And now we're dealing precisely with these biosecurity border issues, with many New Zealanders returning home to flee what's going on in the rest of the world, and many Pacific Island nations are having this in their COVID-free borders. You now have the risk of a new arrival introducing COVID. So what we're learning in New Zealand that we already know from invasive species is it's not about these things never arriving, but being prepared for when they inevitably arrive. We know people will come off the planes with COVID, or rats may jump off a boat, but we have to be prepared for what we do when we know that happens. Next slide. So this is where I've been working with social science colleagues to develop a framework of strategic environmental assessment. These are the analytical and participatory approaches that integrate environmental considerations into policies, plans, and programs, and evaluate those interlinkages with economic and social considerations. In other words, it's not just about treating conservation and biodiversity and biosecurity as a nice to have. These are necessary things to have if we want to protect our island economies and our people. An SEA is different from say, an environmental impact assessment because it's a collection of tools rather than a single template. And invasive species eradication, therefore, is not just a technical problem. When you have a problem species, a problem ant, a problem rat species spreading disease, COVID-19, it's not just about how you technically solve it, it's about how you manage people, how you manage social distancing, how you manage the different processes for people arriving in the country. Next slide. So some of the tools in the SEA toolbox include community and stakeholder engagement techniques, social profiles and baselines and impact assessment, health impact assessments, cost-benefit analyses, ecological baselines and impact assessments, technical feasibility studies, livelihood analysis, social marketing and environmental education, environmental and social monitoring, and institutional analysis and change management. And we use all of these more and more for our conservation management in New Zealand, but we've also been using a number of these tools for managing our COVID response in New Zealand to ensure we can achieve and maintain eradication and biosecurity. Next slide. And we also want to bear in mind protected areas on islands. This slide shows islands around the world and what percentage of them are protected. And on the top left there, you can see that islands with 100% protected areas, those ones are all uninhabited islands, particularly in the sub-Antarctic. The blue islands are the small island developing states I'll talk about shortly. And that line down the middle is those islands that are underrepresented for the global average for protected areas. The global average is about 25% of islands, 25% of an area on an island is in protected area, but in the Pacific, we tend to hit below that. We don't have enough protected areas on islands where we can manage biosecurity and prevent invasions. Next slide. So we have 20 small island developing states in the Pacific, as well as a number of others dotted around the world, particularly in the Caribbean. And if we move on to the next slide, we can see that they're disproportionately represented in our eradication efforts. So although we've done a lot of invasive mammal eradications in the Pacific and elsewhere in the world on islands, most of those have happened, unsurprisingly, on the wealthy states that have Commonwealth and colonization legacies. On the small island developing states, we've done very few eradications. So through using the strategic environmental assessment approach, what we want to do is enable more biodiversity conservation through eradication methods to benefit people's livelihoods and prevent diseases arriving as well through the same biosecurity processes. Next slide. So I just want to sum up by noting that the future of island biodiversity will depend on envisioning these new human-nature relationships on islands, and they have to build on the biocultural knowledge of Indigenous and local people, and make sure they're in line with local and global pathways of long-term sustainability that integrate biodiversity and cultural practices ranging from stewardship to biodiversity-friendly land use practice and regeneration, so we can have the cultural and ecological potentials of island life maximized in the future. Thank you.